I was struggling last week when I was telling people what I was coming over for. They said, what are you heading over for? I said, it's the Cord weekend. And then inevitably they said, what is Cord? And I said, I think it's Christians ordering relationships. And then I said, I don't know what the D stands for. And actually the best I could come up with was disastrously. So I don't think that's what it is. Thanks, Chris and Alyssa, for your vision for this and keeping it going as you have done. And I realise I've not got the O right. It's operating relationships diligently. What a good thing for us to be together to do that. I'm hoping that our study, which is based in the book of Ruth, a lovely little story in the scriptures, will help us to consider the subject, which is putting God first in our relationships, with insights from the book of Ruth. Now, the book of Ruth is short. I don't know that we're going to be able to read it all over the course of the weekend, but we'll certainly read a chapter tonight, and we'll read some of chapter 2 and chapter 3 tomorrow and into chapter 4 tomorrow afternoon. But let's read together in Ruth chapter 1. So grab your copy of God's Word, please, and we'll start with God's Word, and we'll say some things from it as we're helped by God to do so. So, the book of Ruth, and we'll start from the beginning. Now it came about in the days when the judges governed that there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to reside in the land of Moab with his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi. And the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem in Judah. So they entered the land of Moab and remained there. Then Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons, and they took for themselves Moabite women as wives, and the name of one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. And they lived there about 10 years. Then both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the land of Moab, because she had heard in the land of Moab that the Lord had visited his people by giving them food. So she departed from the place where she was, and her 2 daughters-in-law with her, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, Go, return each of you to your mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. May the Lord grant that you may find a place of rest, each one in the house of her husband. And she kissed them, and they raised their voices and wept. However, they said to her, No, but we will return with you to your people. But Naomi said, Return, my daughters. Why should you go with me? Do I still have sons in my womb, that they may be your husbands? Return, my daughters. Go, for I am too old to have a husband. If I said I have hope, if I were even to have a husband tonight and to also give birth to sons, would you therefore wait until they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it is much more bitter for me than for you, because the hand of the Lord has come out against me. And they raised their voices and wept again, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. Then she said, Behold, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. But Ruth said, Do not plead with me to leave you, or to turn back from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you sleep, I will sleep. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and worse, if anything but death separates me from you. When she saw that she was determined to go with her, she stopped speaking to her about it. So they both went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they come to Bethlehem, all the city was stirred because of them. And the women said, Is this Naomi? But she said to them, Do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why do you call me Naomi, since the Lord has testified against me and the Almighty has afflicted me? So Naomi returned, and with her Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, who returned from the land of Moab. And they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest. That's the word of the Lord. It's wonderful to read it together. You know, the book of Ruth is still read today by Jews on one of their feast days. It's the feast of Pentecost or Shavuot. It's one of the 5 scrolls that they will get out, and they'll still read it. And they will get their lessons from it as they do. But we can see a greater fulfillment, can we not, that is there in the book of Ruth that, of course, points us off to God, but also off to Jesus, who is the eternal Son of God, and is the one who has put God first in all things, where everybody else has failed. And the Jews are still wanting to find someone like that. But we know him. And we rejoice to know him, don't we? It's a wonderful thing. I was interested to remember that Pentecost was the celebration of the law having been given on Sinai. After the Passover, then about 50 days had passed and they came to Sinai, and the law was given there. So it's got an association with the instruction of the Lord. But also, and this was a new thing to me in my studies, the Jews commemorate the birth and the death of David at Pentecost. Now, I didn't know that. Now, doesn't that open up something interesting? So from their traditions, they see at this time of the year when they would have their festival and when they would read this book, they're thinking about King David. And that's where the book finishes up. The great ancestor of the Lord himself, the one who is the son of David. Now then, here's a spoiler alert for us. I know this is a couple's enrichment weekend. I think somebody back home described it as that, and I was like, oh, okay. But we have to be careful that we don't romanticize this book. I'd say that again. We can't make it into a romantic love story because that's not what it is. You're like, oh, okay, that's sort of drawn all of the joy out of this thing. No, it hasn't. It is a love story, but it's not about the love story that might be injected into it with the sort of Disney idea of how to come at it, or maybe even more awful, the sort of cultural over-sexualization, which some people then apply to chapter 3 and so on. There's nothing of that in it. It is a love story, because we see characters who become the main characters in this, declaring their love for Yahweh God. And his love is throughout all of this, because he is faithful in his love to his people. That's the love story in this. I'll say this because we'll get to it, I hope, tomorrow. But I think Ruth was acting out of a sense of, I can take hold of the provision in the law. And Boaz could become the man to raise up offspring for Mahlon, my dead husband. So she was taking on something that was in the law for the Israelites. Interesting for a Moabitess. And Boaz himself, I don't think he was overcome with romantic notions and so on, because he was made the offer, and we'll get to that, by Ruth. Spread your garment over us, over me. And he says, I'll do that. Because he was a man who loved the Lord. And he wanted to honor God in it. So that's the love story ultimately in it. Now, love only appears once in the whole of the book, the word love. And it's in the last chapter, I think it's verse 16, when the women, after the child has been born, says to Naomi, your daughter-in-law loves you. And is better than 7 sons. It's the only place where the word love appears. So I hope you see my caution in this, because I do fear sometimes Ruth has been taken and has been made into this wonderful romantic love story because we've been programmed by Disney. But it's not there. But what it is having God as the priority in your life. Love for God in all things. I was reading this morning in just my daily readings, Mark 12. And it had been in my mind yesterday, and there it was, and it comes to me fresh as part of the sequence of my readings, where the Lord says, when he's asked, what's the greatest commandment? He says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, and with all your mind and with all your strength. And the second is like it. You'll love your neighbor as yourself. That's what this book's all about. It's loving the Lord, or in some cases, wavering in that love, But it's loving the Lord and then loving your neighbour as yourself. Now, as couples together, that's the closest of neighbours, is it not? So this is about us loving each other, but that flows out of the love of God that we have come to experience, that we then are able to love because he has first loved us. Yeah? Sorry to labour the point at the beginning. We're getting to the text, but I just want us to come at this and not make it into something a little bit fluffy, I think is the word I would say. I went to Tim Hortons earlier, and I ordered a cappuccino, and Hayley had the first drink of it, and I said, "What's it like?" She says, "It's fluffy." So there you go. So we'll not be having that one again. Now then, to the text. When the judges governed, or when the judges ruled, so I hope you have your Bibles open. We're going to refer to the text as we go through here. The judges, if you know the book before, and many of you will know it, it's a sad spiral of decline, of people stepping away from devotion and love to God into all sorts of idolatry and horrific things associated at the end, interestingly, with Bethlehem. It's injected in there to make us start to think about Bethlehem. There's no accident at all in how the Old Testament fits together and how God the Spirit has superintended over all of the writing. It's just wonderful to see it all fitting together. And then we come to Bethlehem here. The end of Judges, as you know, 3 times it says that in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. It's setting us up for the king who is going to come. And then there's this phrase, and there was a famine in the land. And I think if you were a Hebrew reading this, you would be going, alarm bells in your head. Uh-oh, we've heard that before, because they were good at remembering things when we're not. Because you go back into Genesis, and Genesis chapter 12 and verse 10, you have the same phrase, and Abraham goes down to Egypt, and he makes a right hash of things down there with his wife, doesn't he? And then you carry on to Genesis chapter 26, and it says again, and there was a famine in the land, and what does Isaac do? He goes off to the area of the Philistines, and he makes the same hash of things as his father had done before him. And you're set up now in this first verse, in the days when the judges governed. That's ironic. They weren't really, well, they were raised up by God, but it was for small periods of time in a couple of 100 years, 300 years or so of the period of the judges. And there was a famine in the land. And immediately we're like, uh-oh, this isn't going to go well. And in this case, you have Elimelech, whose name means God is king. And names in the scriptures are no accidents either. And it is wonderful to see how people name their children in the scriptures as well. So God is king, and Naomi, meaning pleasant, you'll know that one. Yes, okay. Is she? Most of the time, okay. So, but you see their decision to leave Bethlehem. Bethlehem means the house of bread. And here is the thing, that God has promised to his people that he will provide for them when they honour him with their devotion and their love. And in the days of the judges, that was waxing and waning. And it must have been a difficult period in their circumstances when this famine is in the land. And Elimelech, God is king, and Naomi, whose name is pleasant, get into such difficulties, it seems, that when their children are born, Mahlon and Chilion means sickly and about to die. That must have been the circumstances in which they found themselves. I don't want us to read too much into this, but there is no accident with what we're given here. And Elimelech and Naomi then make their decision, do they not? Of course they do, to go to Moab. Now, we could spend some time on that, but there was the wicked King Eglon, who for 18 years, at some point in the Judges, had oppressed the people of Israel. And it was horrific. And they had it in their mind that because of the famine, it was expedient, we're going to go east, and we're going to go to Moab. Things will be better there. Now, it seems as though that was going to be a temporary thing. It says they entered the land of Moab, verse 2, and the words that are used there is sojourned, which really has the sense you're going there for a short period of time with the intention of returning to your homeland. But what happens? a short-term intention, a wavering in their trust in God, which I think we have to see in this, do we not? And it becomes a long-term situation. Now there's a lesson for us, is there not? That sometimes in the circumstances of life we can make pragmatic decisions, we think, even prayerfully, that may sometimes take us away from what God ultimately would have for us. Remember, God had said he was going to be dwelling among his people in the territory that was Israel, with his place at this time, which would have been in the tabernacle at Shiloh. And he would be there. And they were going to leave that territory that was God's territory and God's people, and they were going to go out because it was seemingly better to do so. And what might have been a temporary thing in their thinking became a permanent thing for 10 years. That speaks to my heart, certainly, about decisions we make that might be short-term things we think, but then become longer-term things. And that has impacts then on our relationships, does it not? Husband and wife, and with our families, and so on. So there's lessons in this that we need to be very careful to listen to. And then you have the horrific situation where Elimelech seems to die fairly soon after the move. Mahlon and Chilion, it seems, after he has died, then take Moabite wives. Now, Deuteronomy doesn't say they weren't to take Moabite wives. They weren't in the list of the prohibited nations. But by the time of Ezra, which is after this, they were in the list of prohibited nations because of the history of Moab. And there is that instruction in Deuteronomy as well, that no Moabite person was to be allowed into the community or welcomed in for 7 generations, or it might have been 10. I think it's maybe 10. And they go there, and in their new circumstances, away from the house of bread, and away from the place where God's presence was and his people were, they come into very hard times, as is described then by Naomi. He says, the hand of the Almighty El Shaddai has gone out against me. Don't call me Naomi, call me Mara, because what I've experienced is bitter. And just look at the verse 5, the last part of it. It says, the woman was left without her sons and her husband. What a sad situation that had come from that decision. And I've put it in for discussion tomorrow about making decisions as couples together, for ourselves and for our families, and maybe for our churches as well. We can think about that. When circumstances seem to point to being really difficult, and if we were to go this way, it'll be easier. Is that always the way that God will lead us? Many people who've been through difficult times will say that they've come to know the Lord more through their hard times than they have when everything has been rosy. Naomi's tragedy is part of a larger series of events, though, that's going to result in God's blessing. So it has this really downbeat beginning, doesn't it, the book? But it picks up because she gets up, because she's heard. And you have two actions of God in the text, in the whole of the text. This one, where she says, or she has heard that the Lord has visited his people to give them food. There's an action on the Lord's part. The second time is when the Lord enables Ruth to conceive. So the Lord provides, and the Lord provides. That's our God, isn't it? He always provides. She rises with her daughters-in-law to go to the land of Moab, and she has this concern for them both that they would be married. They've been bereaved of their husbands, and she wants them to have security, because back in those days, a woman's position relied so much on the man and all of his provision, and they were left with nothing. And she recognizes that for them to go back to Bethlehem with her is going to be a really difficult thing for them. Outsiders, enemies of God's people, coming with her. No, you don't want to do that. You're not going to find any husbands back in Israel. You should stay here. Go back to your mother's house. Stay with your people, and may you find a husband, and may the Lord be good to you as you have been good to me. What's interesting with Naomi and all of this is that she does, a bit like Job, say that the Lord has afflicted. and sees it as an unjust thing. It's the same language you find in Job as you find here in Ruth. So she's saying that the Lord's hand has gone out against me, but at least she's saying that the Lord's in it. She didn't lose that. And I suggest to you, and I wonder, if when we get to Ruth's conversion experience, which is what I believe it is, and then her commitment that comes as a result of her conversion, that is on the basis of the things that Naomi has been teaching her daughters-in-law. And let's maybe even think that Mahlon and Chilion and Elimelech, well, Elimelech might have died before they were married, but Mahlon and Chilion might even have spoken of the God that they once had worshipped in Bethlehem, 100 kilometers that direction. Maybe that testimony of Naomi in her experience has resulted in Ruth's wonderful conversion and testimony here. Notice the decisions that were made by the two daughters-in-law. So it's really about decisions, chapter 1, isn't it? It's this decision that's made by Elimelech and Naomi, maybe Mahlon and Chilion, if they were of age to do so. They had their family gathering and they said, right, Moab's the best. Let's go do it. And then they get into really difficult circumstances at the end of the 10 years, it seems. Certainly for Naomi, she was bereft of her husband for much of it, but she still had her sons and the daughters-in-law, but then that went too. And you have then this decision for Orpah and for Ruth. And you have Ruth in this very emotive description of what goes on. As they're on the road, they've started out on the way to Bethlehem, and Naomi's trying to make some wise decisions on their behalf, so they might be married and they might have children and they would then prosper and so on. She has their good at heart, Naomi. And Orpah, after the persuasion, she, as Naomi says, look, to Ruth, look, she's gone. She's gone back to her people and her gods. That was the choice. Somebody has written, I think Sinclair Ferguson has described it this way, that Orpah chose everything, i.e., the potential for a husband and a new life and all of that, and the place of her birth with her family all around her. She chose everything. But we never hear of her again. Instead, we're brought to this focal point in Ruth clinging to her mother-in-law. What an image. She's holding on. She says, no, I'm not going anywhere. And then you have that declaration from verse 16, verse 17. But Ruth said, don't plead with me to leave you. Here is Ruth's. Either it's a conversion moment or she's already been converted, that Yahweh, the God of the Israelites, the one who has shown up for them in the past to be their rescuer from Egypt, and all the stories that they would have recounted of that, and then him showing up through the judges in the history of the period of the judges and bringing about great victories with meager resources, we might say, human resources and so on. And she's heard this. And she chooses, as Sinclair Ferguson, she chooses nothing. She chooses Yahweh and nothing. She's a Moabitess. The text keeps telling us that for the reason. Look, we're supposed to think here like a Hebrew person reading the text. What? A Moabitess is going to come back? Why would she do that? We don't want them here, sort of thing. That was their attitude towards them. The law says we're not to welcome them. And here she sets on the road, and she does that after saying to Naomi, your people shall be my people, and your God is my God. Where you die, I will die. And this is an important little thing. And there I will be buried. You know, Ruth had come to understand that the territory geographically of Israel, which was the place of God's presence, when all the nations all around, Moab included, had their gods, their own gods. Chemosh was the god of the Moabites. She says, I don't want anything to do with Chemosh anymore. I'm going to go to where Yahweh is present. And this territory that he has given to his people, I want to be buried there. Because there is something hopeful about being buried there. I think we're given that for a reason, to make us think that there was something in her understanding of what the Jews were looking forward to, which was the great resurrection that was to come. And she's got it. And she has been converted by the grace of God in her experience through the testimony, we assume, of Naomi and others that were there. But her declaration is a wonderful one. And she goes with her mother-in-law, having made the decision. So they went on until they came to Bethlehem, is verse 19. And then the city is stirred. Is this Naomi? Whew. You can imagine she doesn't look like she looked when she left 10 years before. You can imagine that the hardship of having lost her husband and her 2 sons and all that goes with that had really taken its toll. And then you've add on to that the 100-kilometer journey through the territory to get back to Bethlehem. But they come there because that was the place where Elimelech had a land inheritance among the greater inheritance, which was the Lord's inheritance of his people. That's where she comes back to, the house of bread. And Bethlehem suddenly is taken from being a place associated with negative things in the book of Judges, and it starts to change a little. You're like, okay, there's something interesting here about Bethlehem. It's getting slightly more positive. The Lord has visited his people, and he's provided for them. And that's where Naomi heads. She heard about it in the fields of Moab. The word had reached. She could have stayed there. Maybe Ruth and Orpah and maybe the girls could have remarried and so on. But we see something of Naomi's love for the Lord, even in the Lord's hand having gone out against her and her suffering affliction. There still is a remnant of her love for the Lord and her desire to return. And then you have this outsider, Ruth the Moabitess, and she comes too. Look at verse 22. So Naomi returned, and with her Ruth the Moabitess, just so you get it, her daughter-in-law, who returned from the land of Moab. It's making the point that there was the leaving behind of that which had been the former life. We don't hear anything of Ruth's family at all. When Naomi had said to her and Orpah, "Now go back to your mother's house," there was a family there, and Naomi knew of it. It's logical that you go back to your families. Ruth says, no. God is my God. Yahweh is my God. And I will go with you, Naomi. So her love for God, Ruth's love for God, that has flowed out of her understanding of God's love for her and God's love for his people, then motivates her to make her commitment to Naomi. And then begins this wonderful story, which really starts to switch up a gear in chapter 2. So it's not all meant to be really flat tonight, but it's just set in the scene. It's one of the greatest stories, short stories ever written, isn't it? Because chapter 1, you're like, I hope this gets better. And then you spend time with it, but we who've read it so many times, we know the end of the story, and you sort of race through chapter 1, and then you get into the good bits sometimes, is what we might say. But isn't it good just to stop and see the real life situation that these people were facing, and the decisions to put God first in those circumstances? Not at the beginning, we have to assume, with the departure from Bethlehem to Moab, but then later, after the 10 years of a settled existence there, the decisions that are back, looking to Yahweh to provide. And hearing he has provided, we're going back there. And Ruth accompanies her mother-in-law. That's an act of love, isn't it? We don't know how old Naomi was. She's too old to have a husband, she says, but things were different back then, I think. But Ruth couldn't conceive of Naomi making the journey back on her own. It was dangerous enough for the two of them. But here is Ruth in her newfound love for God, the God who has loved her, she then has this love for her neighbour in this moment. That is Naomi, her mother-in-law. She goes with her, and they come to Bethlehem, and then it says, at the beginning of the barley harvest. You're like, okay. And then we have a chapter break. Chapter breaks don't exist in the original text. You know that. They've been put in there to help us to navigate the scriptures, but sometimes they actually don't help us to see the connections. But it just goes on. And this is setting us up for tomorrow. Now, Naomi had a relative of her husband, a man of great wealth, or a man of excellence is a better translation, of the family of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. Oh, right. And Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, please let me go to the field and glean. What's going to happen next? Isn't that a wonderful story? It brings us to the point of such sadness. But in all of that sadness and affliction and so on, there are wise decisions that are made to honour the Lord. And in honouring the Lord, to honour other people. And they come to Bethlehem. And they've got nothing. That's the point I was making earlier about Ruth. She's not expecting any husband from there. She's going to be an outsider. She could be set upon. Even Naomi says that later to her. You stick with Boaz and his workers, because if you don't, you get assaulted. That was the reality. And she goes into that with her eyes open. But her eyes are fixed on Yahweh, the God she has come to know and put her trust in, and says, I want to be with his people.